Key City, we hope that you guys are doing well. We're looking forward, like we said, to seeing you next Sunday. Imagine a lot of you are probably out or connecting with friends, getting ready for the game, as, like I said, we are here. But we are in tonight the second and last week of what's been a two-part conversation called Changing the Game. And the reason we're calling that is because 2,000 years ago, Jesus stepped into a cultural and religious Jewish context, and he came as the fulfillment to Jewish expectations, the fulfillment to Jewish prophecy, the fulfillment to the Jewish scriptures. But as a fulfillment to all those things, Jesus didn't come to continue them as they were. He did not come to continue the law. He didn't come to continue practicing Judaism the way that they had up until that point. He had come to fulfill it, or to complete it, or to bring it to an end. That Jesus had come to completely change the game. And like we talked about last week, Jesus' first century Jewish audience would have been very, very familiar with the game that he came to change. And while they would have been familiar with it, it's not particular to Jesus' first century Jewish audience. In fact, for almost every version of faith across cultures and times, almost every version of faith, you will find this game played. And like we mentioned last week, for some of you, it might be the reason that you walked away, or chose to never walk into the faith that was introduced to you, that you grew up with, or was initially handed to you. And the game is kind of played along these lines. And the lines are that God has been offended, and the goal of the game, the win, is to unoffend God. And we score when we believe, behave, and get others to do the same. And our goal in the game is to get a high enough score so that God won't be offended anymore. That somewhere along the way, humanity behaved other than how God wanted us to behave, believed other than how God wanted us to believe, and it offended God. And so now it's the role of humanity to believe, behave, and get others to do the same in order to change God's disposition towards us, to satisfy, please, appease, to unoffend the offended God. And like we discussed last week, we can recognize that so often in the version of faith where that game is the game that is played, so often when the goal is to please, appease, and satisfy God, so often it comes at a cost to people. That often in that version of faith, people get singled out, people get pointed out, people get left out, and so often division sets in between the defenders of God and the offenders of God. And so often in that version of faith where the goal is to satisfy, please, and appease God, to affect his disposition towards us, so often people become a means to an end. And when people become a means to an end, and you know this because we've seen this throughout history, that when people are a means to an end, people end up being undervalued and ultimately end up being overlooked. And while this version of faith can get people to believe and it can get people to behave, it rarely makes people whole, and it rarely heals people in the way that most of us need to be healed. And so it's no wonder that people often walk away from, or choose to never walk in to versions of faith where that game is played. And the good news is that Jesus came to change that game. The version of Judaism that Jesus walked into in the first century was a version of Judaism where the Jewish religious leaders, the Pharisees, were perpetuating and defending this game of setting themselves up as the defenders of the offended God. And the result was that people were overlooked, and people were undervalued, and people were being isolated from God. And like we talked about last week, and if you missed it, we'd encourage you to go back and check it out. You can find it on our YouTube channel by searching for Key City Church. But what we discovered last week was that Jesus came to change the game by redefining the win. That he took the version of faith that was being practiced, a version of faith in which people served God, and he flipped it upside down into a version of faith in which God came to serve people and was inviting people to join him, where devotion to God was demonstrated not by people's commitment to law, but by people's care for other people. That through Jesus was expressing that what God cares less about is what he needs from you. In fact, God is far less concerned about what he needs from you. He's God. He's fine, and is far more concerned about the needs of the who right in front of you. That at the end of the day, God desires for people to be seen not as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. And Jesus intended to change the game, to redefine the win. And maybe few people understand this. Few people understood how Jesus changed the game by redefining the win, as well as a man named Paul. Let me just point out before we get into Paul's story that when you change the game by redefining the win, you change the way you play the game. That when the game is changed by redefining the win, you change the way you play the game. When you change the way you keep the score, you don't play the same way anymore. Like if tonight at halftime, all of a sudden they changed the way that the score was kept and said, you know what, from now on, field goals are going to be worth 6 points and touchdowns are going to be worth 3 points. The strategy of the game, how the game is played, all the tactics would change. Because when you change the way you keep score, you don't play the same anymore. And this was the point that we find a man named Paul driving home over and over and over again. And if you don't know who Paul was, let me introduce you to Paul. Paul, 2,000 years ago, was a contemporary of Jesus. He lived at the same time as Jesus, and Paul was a Pharisee. Paul was one of the Jewish religious leaders who was devoted to defending the offended God, to the point that when the Jesus movement started to grow, Paul saw it as an offense to God, and he set himself up in the role of defending the offended God from the offenders who were following this Jesus. In fact, the first place that we see Paul show up in the New Testament, Paul is standing by, holding the coats of, and giving his assent and approval as a contingent of Pharisees throw rocks at a follower of Jesus named Stephen, until the trauma from the rock's impacts brought him to the point that his body could no longer sustain life. And he died in this brutal, appalling way that was a demonstration of what happens to people when God is viewed as a God that needs to be appeased and pleased, where God is set up as a God who needs to be defended against the offenders, that it always ends up costing people. And it was that event that seems to have launched Paul into this strategy of going after and shutting down the Jesus movement. And we find Paul in the New Testament going from city to city and finding and hunting down followers of Jesus to arrest them and lock them up because he saw himself as the defender of the offended God. In Paul's mind, this is how he was scoring points with God. And I need to shift off this seat because it is like squeaking like crazy. And I don't know if you can hear that, but it's making me like insane.
It's like you're sitting on a guinea pig or something.
I felt like it was getting offensive to God. Honestly. I think he's more satisfied now, though.
We're good. Let's just wrap it up. We're good.
Good. That's how we do. So Paul is going from town to town, hunting down followers of Jesus, because in Paul's mind, this was scoring him points with God. And it was on his way to a city called Damascus, where to arrest and persecute and put in prison followers of Jesus. And it was on his way there that he met the resurrected Jesus. And instead of punishment, instead of disappointment, instead of offense, and how could you, and how dare you, instead, Paul experienced grace. And he came face to face with the God who had come to prove that he is not a God who needs to be served by us, but is a God who has come to serve us. And he invited Paul to join him. And Paul became a follower of Jesus. And Paul, who is single-handedly dismantling the Jesus movement, became a proponent of expanding the Jesus movement throughout the Roman Empire. And so Paul planted these communities of followers of Jesus throughout the Roman Empire and then wrote letters to them to encourage them. And along the way, one of the pitfalls that these young early churches, these young communities of followers of Jesus would fall back into time and time again, it was like what they constantly defaulted to was following Jesus into this version of faith in which God was offended and their job was to unoffend him. And within the early church, it was causing division. It was causing people to be singled out. It was causing people to be left out. And so we find Paul writing letters to these followers, to these communities of Jesus followers. And one of the things that he reiterates over and over and over again is that that's not the game that Jesus is inviting us to play, that he came to change the game. And so in one of these letters that Paul wrote to a group of followers of Jesus in the city of Rome, Paul writes them this letter, and he's just unpacking God's grace and unpacking God's mercy. And at the end of this Paul giving this just really high and amazing depiction of the grace and mercy of God. What Paul says is, in light of God's mercy, give yourselves to devote your body to Christ as a living sacrifice. In light of God's mercy, devote yourselves fully to him. Sacrifice your bodies as a living sacrifice. He says, in light of God's mercy, not because God is offended, not to make God not angry with you anymore, not in order to please God, not in order to satisfy God, not in order to appease God, but because of God's mercy, offer your bodies to him as a living sacrifice. Not offer God a token of service, not try to score points or earn points with God so he's not mad at you. No. Paul says, devote your bodies to, go all in. Give your body, yourself, your whole self, your all of you, leave it all on the field. Not to make God happy, not to appease him, but because of his grace. And Paul knew how his audience was going to hear this, that they were going to hear it as, we have to devote ourselves in order to please God. And so to correct their thinking and to adjust their paradigm of understanding to re-illustrate how completely Jesus came to change the game, Paul says, let me give you some examples. For example, humble yourself and use your gifts to serve others in your community. Love one another. Honor one another. For example, love even your enemy. And for example, submit yourselves to the authorities that you are under. And to put the icing on the cake so that they could not miss it, what Paul says at the end of this string of examples of what it looks like to give your body as a living sacrifice to God, at the end of this string of examples, Paul writes something that in the church, when they would have read this 2,000 years ago, because that's how letters were distributed, they'd go to the church and then someone would read the letter to the church. Probably when they got to this part and read what Paul says next, it would have caused Paul's first century Jewish audience to all raise their hands and say, wait. Read that part again, because we don't think we heard you correctly, because obviously Paul did not write what we think that you just read, right? This is how jaw-dropping what Paul says would have been to his first century Jewish audience. What Paul writes is that the only debt that should remain outstanding is the continuing debt. The only debt that should remain outstanding, like the only difference, the only gap, the only delta, the only thing that you should be working at to make even, like the only score that you should be watching to close the gap and make it even, like the scoreboard that you should be watching, is your continuing debt, your continuing commitment to make up the gap for. And what he doesn't say is your continuing score with God, to close the gap with God. He doesn't say, like, the scoreboard that you should be watching is your score with God. It's not close the gap with God. It's not get even with God. It's not make things right with God. The scoreboard that Paul refers to, that we should be closing the gap for, Paul does not say that scoreboard is with God. Paul says, let no debt remain outstanding except your continuing debt to love one another. Because the one who loves his neighbor fulfills the entire law, which would have made all of the listeners of Paul's letter just pause in their tracks and say, hold on, wait, you mean like the whole law? Like the law that is over 600 commands that we've been following for 1,500 years. You are just going to set that aside and say that that whole thing is just summarized with love our neighbor. And Paul would say, yes, that was the whole point. That the whole point of the law was not to score points with God, but to score points with people. Paul's saying the scoreboard that we should be watching, the scoreboard that you should be watching and watching to put points on, is the scoreboard between you and people. That's the only one. There is no other scoreboard between you and God, because God's fine. He's like, we're even. We're good. I don't need anything from you. We don't need to watch, Paul says, the scoreboard with God. The only one we need to watch is our score and our continuing debt to love one another. And then Paul says, in the commands that you shall not commit adultery, that you shall not murder, that you shall not steal, that you shall not covet. And then Paul says, and whatever other commands there may be, knowing that there are over 600 commands that the Jews were expected to follow, he says, and whatever other commands that that there may be are summed up in this one command, which would make his audience pause and say, wait, are you allowed to do this? I mean, do you know how thick the Bible is? Like, you are going to condense it down to one command? And if you've ever been intimidated by how thick the Bible is and you just wish somebody would condense it for you, this is what Paul is doing for you. He's saying, we can boil it down to one thing. And what gives Paul the authority to boil all of the Old Testament law down to one thing? Because it's the one command that Jesus gave his followers. Paul says it's summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself, because love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, it's the fulfillment of the entire law. Paul was making it clear that Jesus came to change the game by redefining the win. And when we change the way that we keep score, we don't play the same anymore. That the goal of the game is no longer scoring points with God to close the gap with God and get even with God. Paul said the only scoreboard you should be watching is your continuing debt, trying to even the score by loving one another, by loving your neighbor as yourself. And when that's the score, whatever version of faith you might have, you don't play the same anymore. And if loving one another is just too ambiguous, Jesus put it on display for us to know what that means. That Jesus laid down his life for us, to set the example for us, what his way of love looks like. That it's laying down and being willing to give our best for the best of others. To be willing to give our bodies as a living sacrifice, to give our entire selves, our best for the best of others. That what guides us in the Monday to Sunday living should be the question, how do I leverage my best for the best of others? And here's what I know, that when we start to ask this question, the initial impulsive response is, if I walk through my life devoted to giving my best for the best of others, I am going to hit empty by like Monday afternoon, right? Because there are so many open hands around me. There are so many needs around me. There are so many things that people are wanting from me that if you expect me to walk into my life and be willing to give my best for the best of others, I'm going to tank before the end of the week. And here's how I respond to that. The response is, if you're giving your best to for the best of others causes you to tank, if it's not sustainable, then it's not your best for the best of others. Because leveraging our best for the best of others means that we have to manage our best so that it can be sustainable, which requires us to ask the question, how do I leverage my best? How do I manage my best for the best of others? What do I need for me? What are the boundaries that I need to create for me? What are the things that I need to do for me? What are the things that I need to develop and cultivate? What are the ways that I need to rest and replenish so that I can be at my best for the best of others? That question would drive everything that we do and everything that we choose. That would be the filter for our entire lives, to ask ourselves the question, is this helping me become my best for the best of others? In what ways do I need to deal with my past to be at my best for the best of others? In what ways do I need to heal to be at my best for the best of others? What things do I need to grieve and let go of so that I can be at my best for the best of others? What are the things that God has planted inside of me? The longings, the desires, the giftings, the abilities, the personality that God has shaped in me. Like, how do I take those things and cultivate them so that I can leverage them to free other people, to learn how to leverage those things for themselves? How can I become my best to encourage and release and free other people towards their best? That would become the driving question. It would change the way that we play the game. It was what Jesus' first century audience, Jesus' first century followers, the early church, it's what they knew, it's what they believed, and it's what they did. And because of it, the early church was irresistible. One of the eyewitnesses, one of the companions of the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life tells us that after Jesus' death and resurrection, that the early church came together and they shared everything in common, that they lived out this love one another, my best for your best kind of living. And the result was that the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved, that people saw their love. They might not have believed everything that they believed, might not have understood everything that they taught, but they had loved the way that they loved, and they were drawn to it. That the church, that these Jesus communities were meant to put on display for the entire onlooking world to see that this is how life was meant to work. This is how God intended us to live, to showcase Jesus' way of love for the entire world and to invite the entire world into it. And it's what they did. And it emanated out of them. And it impacted their communities to the point that Roman emperors wrote letters of just anger and exasperation because what they saw throughout their empire were people who were giving their devotion to these communities of followers of Jesus instead of the empire. And what one Roman emperor wrote was, they are not only caring for their own poor, but ours as well. And people are being won over to them. That the empire became jealous of the love and the generosity of the church, and was the love of the local church, living out Jesus' way of love, my best for your best living, that ultimately changed an empire and eventually changed the world. And at Key City Church, we believe that kind of love can change the world again. And we are devoted to following Jesus and his way of love and inviting the onlooking world into it. And if you want to discover, if you are interested in, but what does that look like? Like, how do I enter into this? Like, make this practical for me in my day-to-day life. If that's something that's intriguing or interesting to you, we are so ecstatic about that and would invite you back to join us next Sunday at 5 p.m. We'll be here on Facebook Live. We'll also be in person in downtown Frederick at New Spire Arts. And we're going to be kicking off a brand new series called Getting in the Way. And we're going to be talking about how often the things that Jesus invites us into seem like things that get in the way. But they're the things that actually get us in the way of Jesus' way of love and get us on the way to the things that we're all already searching for and longing for. And we would love for you guys to join us there. Can I pray for us? Father, we are just so grateful for you, for the grace that you give us, for the love that you've lavished upon us, for your continued faithfulness to us. And we are so excited for what you have planned and have in store for Key City Church. And are just so excited to partner with you on this journey and so excited to see how you will use this to connect with people, to reveal yourself, to reveal your love, to make your heart known to people and invite them back in to fellowship, relationship with you, and to walk with them and prove out your faithfulness to them and free them to experience and engage in their lives in the ways that we've always longed to. We're just so grateful and praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.